The first time I noticed it, I told myself I was being oversensitive. We were at my sister-in-law Patricia's house for Sunday dinner, something that had become a monthly tradition since my husband Daniel and I moved back to town 3 years ago. The dining room table stretched long and elegant beneath her crystal chandelier, set with her good china and linen napkins folded into perfect triangles. Patricia had always been particular about appearances, about maintaining the family image that our branch of the Castellanos represented something special in this community. My children, Sophie and Lucas, were 8 and 6 then, still young enough to be excited about family gatherings, still innocent enough to expect warmth from the people who shared their blood. They dressed carefully that morning, Sophie in her Sunday dress with the flower pattern, Lucas in the button-down shirt he usually complained about. They'd been taught their manners, knew to wait their turn, to say please and thank you, to listen when adults spoke. According to YouTube analytics, 99% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. But at that table, surrounded by Patricia's children, Olivia, Marcus, and young Preston, and my brother-in-law Richard's twins, Emma and Ethan, my kids might as well have been invisible. "Olivia, darling, tell everyone about your piano recital," Patricia cooed, her hand resting proudly on her daughter's shoulder. Olivia, 11 and precocious, launched into a detailed account of her performance, and the table listened with rapt attention. Daniel's mother, Gloria, beamed from the head of the table, nodding along with every word. When Sophie quietly mentioned that she'd also had a recital that week, her small voice barely made it across the table before Patricia smoothly interrupted. "That's nice, dear. Marcus, tell Grandma about your soccer tournament." The conversation flowed around my children like water around stones when Lucas tried to share about the science fair project he'd won second place for, something he'd worked on for weeks, staying up late with Daniel to perfect his volcano model. Richard spoke over him about Ethan's straight A report card. Lucas's face fell, his excitement crumbling into something that looked too much like shame for a 6-year-old to bear. I squeezed his hand under the table and caught Daniel's eye. He'd noticed too, I could tell by the tightness around his mouth. But what could we say? How do you call out your family for something so subtle, so deniable? They weren't being cruel, exactly. They simply weren't being kind. They weren't seeing my children at all. The pattern repeated itself month after month, year after year. Every Sunday dinner became an exercise in swallowing my frustration, in watching my children's eager faces dim as they were talked over, interrupted, dismissed. When Sophie made honor roll, Patricia changed the subject to Olivia's acceptance into the gifted program. When Lucas learned to ride his bike without training wheels, Richard regaled everyone with tales of the twins. Athletic prowess, my children's accomplishments, their stories, their very presence, seemed to be nothing more than background noise to the rest of the family. Gloria, my mother-in-law, was perhaps the most painful part of it all. She doted on Patricia's children with an affection that felt almost theatrical, keeping photographs of them prominently displayed in her living room, while pictures of Sophie and Lucas remained tucked away in albums. She never forgot Olivia's birthday, but had to be reminded about Sophie's. She attended every one of Marcus's soccer games, but always had an excuse when Lucas invited her to his school events. "Mom plays favorites," Daniel admitted to me one night after a particularly difficult dinner. We were in bed, the house quiet, the kids finally asleep after Sophie had cried about feeling invisible. She always has. Patricia was the golden child, and now Patricia's kids are the golden grandchildren. "It's not fair to Sophie and Lucas," I whispered, my throat tight. "They're good kids, Daniel. They're smart and kind, and they try so hard to be noticed." "I know," he said, and I heard the helplessness in his voice. "I know." I thought about confronting them, about standing up at one of those dinners and demanding they acknowledge my children, see them, treat them with the basic respect that families should offer. But Daniel urged caution. "It'll just make things worse," he said. "They'll deny it, make us look like we're overreacting, and then it'll be even more awkward." So I stayed silent. I endured. I taught my children to find their worth not in their grandmother's approval or their aunt and uncle's attention, but in themselves, in our small family unit, in the unconditional love Daniel and I could provide. I taught them dignity in the face of dismissal, grace under slights they were too young to fully understand. Sophie grew quieter at family gatherings, her natural exuberance dimming into careful observation. Lucas stopped volunteering information altogether, content to push food around his plate and wait for the ordeal to end. It broke my heart in small ways every single month, these tiny erosions of my children's confidence. But I held my head high and never let Patricia or Richard or Gloria see how deeply their indifference cut. Years passed. Sophie entered high school, Lucas middle school. The Sunday dinners continued, though my children now came reluctantly, fulfilling an obligation rather than enjoying family time. They'd learned not to expect anything, and in that learning, something precious had been lost. Then Olivia graduated high school and left for an expensive private college 3 states away. Marcus followed 2 years later, choosing a university on the opposite coast. Preston, the youngest of Patricia's children, decided to attend boarding school for his final 2 years of high school, and Richard's twins, Emma and Ethan, both accepted scholarships to schools far from home. Suddenly, the family dynamic shifted. The Golden grandchildren were scattered, busy with their own lives, their visits home becoming rare and brief. Patricia and Richard found themselves with empty nests, their spacious homes echoing with absence. Gloria, aging now and moving slower, began to feel the distance keenly. "I wish the kids would visit more," she complained one Sunday, when it was just Daniel, myself, Sophie, Lucas, and Gloria at her house for dinner. Patricia was busy. Olivia had a brief weekend home and wanted just family time. Richard was visiting the twins at their university. Sophie, now 16 and possessed of a quiet strength that reminded me of myself, simply nodded politely. Lucas, at 14, said nothing at all. They'd learned not to point out the irony, not to mention that they'd always been right here, always available, always overlooked. I watched my mother-in-law's face, saw the first glimmers of understanding beginning to dawn, and felt no satisfaction in it. Only a deep, tired sadness. The real turning point came a year later, during Christmas. It was the first time in 5 years that all of Patricia's children would be home at the same time, and she'd planned an elaborate family gathering. Gloria was beside herself with excitement, talking about it for weeks beforehand. When Christmas Day arrived, the house was perfection. A 12-foot tree, lights strung with mathematical precision, a feast that had taken Patricia days to prepare. Gloria arrived early, dressed in her finest, her face bright with anticipation. But Olivia showed up 3 hours late, distracted and glued to her phone, barely greeting anyone before retreating to her old room to take video calls with friends. Marcus arrived on time but immediately asked if anyone minded if he left early. He had plans with his girlfriend's family. Preston, who'd brought friends from boarding school, spent the entire dinner talking only to them, laughing at inside jokes that excluded everyone else at the table. I watched Patricia's face as her children dismissed her efforts, ignored her attempts at conversation, treated the carefully planned gathering as an inconvenience. I watched Gloria try repeatedly to engage her beloved grandchildren, only to be met with distracted murmurs and hasty excuses. I watched Richard grow increasingly frustrated as the twins spent dinner texting, barely touching the food on their plates. And then, in a moment that felt almost scripted by some cosmic playwright, Gloria turned to Sophie and Lucas. "Tell me about school," she said. And there was something desperate in her voice, a need to connect with someone, anyone. "What are you both studying?" Sophie glanced at me, and I saw the decision flicker across her face. The choice to be petty or gracious, to repay years of neglect with coldness, or to rise above it. My daughter, my beautiful, strong daughter, chose grace. "I'm taking AP Literature and AP History," she said. "I'm thinking about studying journalism in college. I want to tell stories that matter, give voice to people who are overlooked." The irony of those words hung in the air like incense. Lucas, following his sister's lead, shared about his interest in computer science, the coding club he'd joined, the app he was developing. Gloria listened with an attention she'd never given them before, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. Patricia, from across the table, watched in silence as her mother connected with the grandchildren she'd ignored while her own children continued to dismiss her. Later that evening, after Olivia had left early with barely a goodbye, after Marcus had rushed off to his girlfriends, after Preston and his friends had retreated to the basement, Patricia approached me in the kitchen where I was helping clean up. Your kids are really wonderful, she said softly, not meeting my eyes. They're so present. I paused in wrapping leftovers, choosing my words carefully. They've always been here, Patricia. They've always been present. She flinched, and I saw understanding crash over her like a wave. I didn't see it before, she whispered. I didn't see them. I was so focused on my own children, on making sure they shined, that I didn't. She trailed off, her voice breaking. No, I agreed quietly. You didn't. I'm sorry, she said, and the words sounded hollow because they were years too late, because my children had already learned to protect themselves by not expecting anything from her. But I nodded, accepting the apology not because it healed the wounds, but because holding on to bitterness would only poison my own peace. The months that followed brought a stark reversal that felt almost mythical in its symmetry. Patricia's children, once so attentive and successful, began to struggle. Olivia dropped out of her expensive college, overwhelmed and directionless. Marcus broke up with his girlfriend and moved back home, unemployed and depressed. Preston got expelled from boarding school for repeated behavioral issues. Richard's twins barely called home, their distance now not just physical, but emotional, leaving their parents confused and hurt by the sudden coldness. Meanwhile, Sophie earned a full scholarship to a prestigious journalism program. Lucas won a national coding competition and was being recruited by tech companies before he'd even graduated high school. They'd flourished despite the years of being overlooked, or perhaps because of them, they'd learned to find validation from within, to work hard without expecting external praise, to be resilient in the face of indifference. Gloria began to spend more time with us, drawn to the warmth and closeness of our family dinners, so different from the strained, awkward gatherings at Patricia's house, where her once perfect children now barely spoke to each other or their mother. She would watch Sophie and Lucas interact with Daniel and me, see the easy affection and genuine interest we showed in each other's lives. And I could see the regret written across her aging face. I made mistakes, she told me one afternoon, when she'd come to watch Lucas's robotics competition. Patricia was supposed to come too, but Olivia needed her for something. Another crisis, another demand. I see that now. I thought Patricia's children needed more attention because they were more accomplished. But your children were accomplished too. I just wasn't looking. No, I said, keeping my voice even. You weren't. Can you forgive me? I looked at this woman who'd shown my children such casual indifference, who'd made them feel less than for years, and I felt the weight of holding on to anger. I'm not the one you need to ask, I said. But Gloria, forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing not to let it poison the future. She nodded slowly, tears tracking down her wrinkled cheeks. I want to be better. I want to know them, really know them, if they'll let me. It wasn't a Hollywood ending, where everything suddenly became perfect. Sophie and Lucas were kind to their grandmother, but there was a carefulness there now, a protective distance. They'd answer her questions, let her into their lives in small ways, but the easy, unconditional trust that could have existed was gone, replaced by a polite warmth that acknowledged the relationship without fully embracing it. Patricia tried too, making efforts to connect with Sophie and Lucas that felt awkward and forced because they lacked the foundation of years of genuine interest. She'd ask about their activities with an enthusiasm that felt desperate, trying to make up for lost time in ways that only highlighted how much time had been lost. My children were kind but guarded, offering her the courtesy of family without the closeness of true connection. The final family dinner of that year fell on New Year's Eve. We gathered at Gloria's house, and the difference from years past was striking. Olivia sat in a corner scrolling through her phone, barely participating. Marcus spent most of the evening outside smoking, avoiding conversation. Preston was sullen and uncommunicative. The twins had declined to come home at all, but Sophie and Lucas, now 17 and 15, sat at that table with quiet confidence. When Gloria asked about their plans for the new year, they shared openly Sophie's acceptance to multiple journalism programs, Lucas's decision to enter a prestigious summer tech camp. Patricia and Richard listened with expressions that mixed admiration and regret, seeing clearly now what they'd missed all along. As midnight approached and we gathered to count down, I looked around at the faces of my family and felt something shift inside me, the anger I'd carried for so long, the hurt at watching my children be dismissed, the bitterness at their suffering. It all seemed to release its grip on my heart, not because justice had been served in some satisfying way, but because I realized I no longer needed it. As you, children had survived, they'd thrived, they'd learned resilience and self-reliance and the kind of inner strength that doesn't depend on others' validation. They'd become remarkable not despite being overlooked, but perhaps in some way because of it. They'd learned that dignity comes from within, that worth isn't determined by who pays attention to you, and that grace in the face of unfairness is its own kind of power. The wrongdoers, Patricia, Richard, Gloria, they'd fallen not through any action of mine, not through revenge or confrontation, but through the natural consequences of their own choices. They'd invested all their attention in children they'd spoiled and put on pedestals, children who'd learned to expect adoration without earning it, who'd never developed the resilience or gratitude that comes from sometimes being overlooked. And now they were reaping what they'd sown, distant, struggling children who took them for granted because they'd always been taken for granted as superior. Meanwhile, my children, who'd been forced to find their own worth, who'd learned to work hard without expectation of praise, who'd developed character in the shadows, they were flourishing. Not because I'd sought revenge, not because I'd fought for justice, but because I'd taught them to be strong, to be dignified, to be resilient. I taught them that sometimes the world is unfair, but that doesn't mean you stop being your best self. As the clock struck midnight and everyone hugged and wished each other a happy new year, Sophie squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for teaching us that we didn't need their approval to know we were enough." And Lucas, overhearing, added, "And for never being bitter, even when you had every right to be." I pulled them both close, these children who'd endured years of being invisible and emerged stronger for it, and felt tears of pride and peace stream down my face. The karma, they say, what goes around comes around. It had come full circle. Not because I'd pushed it, not because I demanded it, but because truth and resilience and dignity always, eventually, rise to the surface. Patricia caught my eye across the room, and in her expression, I saw everything unsaid. The apology, the regret, the acknowledgement of what she'd missed. I nodded once, accepting not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd forgiven, because holding on to the pain served no purpose anymore. The moral victory wasn't in watching her children stumble while mine soared. It was in knowing that I'd raised my children right, that I'd taught them grace in the face of injustice, that I'd shown them how to find their worth from within, rather than seeking it from those too blind to see it. The moral victory was in the peace I felt now, the absence of bitterness, the presence of genuine happiness for my children's success. As we drove home that night, the city lights blurring past the car windows, Sophie and Lucas chatting excitedly in the back seat. About the year ahead, Daniel reached over and took my hand. "You did good," he said quietly. "All those years, biting your tongue, teaching them dignity instead of resentment. You did so good." I smiled, feeling the last of the old hurt dissolve like morning mist. "We did good," I corrected, and so did they. They chose to be kind people, even when kindness wasn't shown to them. That's all them. In the rearview mirror, I could see my children's faces, bright with hope and confidence, and the kind of inner light that comes from knowing your own worth, regardless of who else sees it. They'd been ignored, overlooked, dismissed, and they'd survived it with their hearts intact. They'd learned the most important lesson anyone can learn, that you don't need everyone to see your value for you to have value, that the opinion that matters most is your own. The tables had turned not through any action of mine, but through the simple passage of time and the inevitable consequence of treating some people as more worthy than others. Those who'd been elevated without earning it had struggled when real life demanded resilience. Those who'd been forced to find their own strength had discovered they were stronger than anyone knew. And me, I'd found peace, not in watching others fall, but in watching my children rise, not in vindication, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd done right by my kids even when the world didn't. Not in karma's revenge, but in karma's balance. The universe gently but firmly correcting the scales, teaching everyone involved the lessons they needed to learn. As we pulled into our driveway, our modest home warm with light, I realized that this was the happiest ending I could have hoped for, not dramatic confrontations or satisfying takedowns, but simply this: my children strong and thriving, my conscience clear, my heart at peace. The injustice had been real, the pain genuine, but we'd endured it with dignity and emerged on the other side whole. Sometimes karma doesn't look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like resilience. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in seeing your enemies fall, but in standing strong when they do, offering grace instead of gloating, choosing peace over bitterness. That night, in the warmth of my home, surrounded by the family who mattered most, I understood that truth with absolute clarity. We'd been ignored, but we'd never been invisible. Not to each other, not to ourselves. And in the end, that was all that mattered.